Hi, I am Violet, and I will be taking you through first Chapter 12, Gender and Sexual Orientation of our book. And there is the first section, which we're probably not going to cover as much, which basically just goes over the main model used for arousal, for the four-step model by Masters and Johnson of the four-step model of arousal, getting that pleasure, orgasm, then coming down from it, going back to normal. And it goes through alternate models and explains a bit more detail on different parts of the physical part of gender and sexuality. And for going into the psychological aspects of that, you kind of need to know the double standard that men and women face. That men are allowed to be more sexual in the sense that they are permitted to be promiscuous, to have casual sex, to hook up with people, and sometimes are encouraged to do so or rewarded by peers or otherwise. Meanwhile, women from those same groups to themselves are expected to not do any of that. They're expected to be conservative and not have casual sex at all. Otherwise, they are labeled a slut. And that is a very that causes a bit of a gender difference because it makes women less likely to masturbate or approve of casual sex because they can't do it. They aren't allowed to. And that this inability to masturbate, in the sense of men are told about masturbation, that this is an option, and women aren't. They just discover that this is an option by themselves, more or less. There are exceptions, but this is generally the rule. And this inability to know inability for women to know their own bodies makes it so they can't tell their partner how to make them orgasm, which causes less orgasms during sex. And women also respond to more stimuli, to where it doesn't matter the gender of the sexual stimuli that they are looking at as much as it does for men, and sometimes they're even unaware that they're aroused, which is an interesting concept. And it makes it very, very difficult to know if these gender differences are due to society or due to the gender. And as for sexual development, this discouragement of masturbation, specifically for girls, as I said, doesn't allow them to know themselves. This is where the double standard comes in, where women are judged more, that there is a media romanticization of how sex is supposed to feel like, and it ends up girls feeling disappointed because they don't know what pleasure is supposed to feel like, because they don't masturbate. They have these mind-blowing media representations that often over-exaggerate, and it becomes a very, very difficult process for women to navigate the world as they develop, as people and as adolescents. And now, as we bring in intersectionality with transgender, gender, and race, that there is some complexity to the way that you can classify sexualities of transgender people. Do you do it by their birth sex? Do you do it by their identity, that their gender identity? Oftentimes, it's up to the person, is what it comes down to. Or you would default to their gender identity. And there was a study conducted that showed that as people were older and transgender really wasn't a known thing yet, that they used their birth sex because they didn't know how they felt in their gender identity, only that they only knew what gender that they preferred to interact with sexually. And now when you bring race into this, it gets even more complex. That all these gender differences, as always, focus on white women. There is less gender difference for black women, and Asian Americans are very, very conservative just altogether, and sex is considered fairly a taboo subject, whereas everything else is invisible. But we do know a few things. For example, that back during, well, slavery goes back into a double standard of how the old white masters could basically rape female black slaves and not get any repercussions for it. But if you reverse those genders of it being a white woman and a male black slave, it could be punishable by death. That is an extreme thing of the double standard, and it's absolutely horrible. Completely horrible. And there is a few more things, specifically about masturbation, that the black women often masturbate earlier than even black men or white women. It shows a bit more differences on how ethnicity or race can influence the sexual development of people. Yeah. Awkward phrasing, but it's fine. And there are quite a few similarities as well. For example, with premarital intercourse. That is a major thing on how back in the 1940s there was a survey conducted on premarital intercourse, and 71% of men had premarital intercourse and only 33% of women did. Now, much more recently, 78% of men and 70% of women. Those differences have shrunk. This is why it has gotten so much better. This double standard is going away, but it is nowhere near that point. We're making improvements, and that's what matters. And so that's like the main big thing that the book brings about the similarities. But there are quite a few things. Now, we're getting into gender and sexual orientation. There is a lot of vocab that will be hard to remember if you are not knowledgeable or familiar with the LGBTQ plus community. So, bear with me, accept me as a guide, because I know a lot. So, first is sexual orientation, where it is someone's erotic and emotional orientation towards specific genders, specifically. And its attraction. Now there is a bit more difference between specifically just romantic and sexual, but the book doesn't go into that, so do not worry. We're not going to go into that. But we mainly talk about lesbian and bisexual women, where lesbian is that orientation is towards only other women, and bisexual is anyone who's orientated towards both men and women, which is kind of with the gender binary, which we don't like that. Not anymore. So it's important to know that while the book doesn't mention them, there are other sexualities, such as asexual, which is mentioned in other sections. There is demisexual, which you need to have a strong emotional connection before you get the sexual attraction. And there's also pansexual, which you can probably see in the background. So that is some extra information that's probably not going to be that important, but still good for you to know. And queer. It used to be a slur. We took it back. Yeah. Some people still are offended by this term as it was used as a slur against them personally. So be very, very careful when you say the word queer. Even people who are of the community have to be careful because they don't know if other people of the community was attacked using the word queer. So it refers to all of the sexual minorities, and even transgender people as well. It's an umbrella term. So instead of like saying I'm gay as a blanket term for being a part of the LGBTQ community, once everyone has reclaimed the word queer, you can just say I'm queer. That way it's still easy. Whereas sexual minority is an umbrella term for anyone who's not straight and behaves that way. So those are quite a few of the definitions that are very, very important as we go into Chapter 3, Gender and Sexual Orientation. Now we get into queer theory, which goes by two rules. Binary should be challenged, and sexual orientation can be fluid and dynamic, not fixed, biologically based. Granted, that does not mean that we can choose. That they shift over time like anything else, we just cannot choose them. Okay. And that brings into the concept of performativity, which is the idea that gender and sexual orientation are constructed through constant performances. Specifically, like, I feel like a woman. So I am going to put on makeup, take care of my hair, trim my nails, paint them, wear a dress, and be pretty. That's the performance. I don't normally do all that stuff. That would be a performance. Or, I feel like a man. I am going to put on a button down, put on a bow tie, put my hair up and walk with confidence. So it's how you portray yourself. Now, there are a lot of discrimination that goes against the community of the sexual minorities and, well, queers. There is homophobia, where it's a strong irrational fear of sexual minority people. And don't oftentimes it's not quite right to just say homophobia, simply because while it may be hateful and it may resemble homophobia, they just might just have really, really intense anti-gay prejudice. They are very, very similar, they go hand in hand, and it's just, you have negative attitudes, a lot of negative attitudes, a lot of serious negative attitudes, and you behave against and aggressively towards people of the LGBTQ plus community. There is always bias towards people based on their non-heterosexual orientation. So, heterosexism being the fact that, oh, if someone comes out as lesbian and happens to lose their job, it could be heterosexism, which is illegal. We have protections now. And the, well, fact that, oh, it's just assumed that you're straight until you say you're not, and then it becomes a big deal, which is heteronormativity, if I could pronounce that word. So we're not going to worry about that. And there is a lot of long-term studies of back then and now which go over the very, very intense stigma, that's the word, stigma, against the people of the community. And while in the past, over 70% of people believe that it's always wrong, we've brought that down to only 46%, so we're making improvements, but it's still nowhere near equal. Just making sure that I'm on track. There is a lot of hate crimes, which can range from just being verbally harassed by having slurs used against you, or it could go as far as assault or even murder. And there is a really, really big problem about that, because this isn't in the book at all. It's just something that needs to be made aware of, which goes to prove these hate crimes are still a thing because this is still legal to do. So, if you have ever heard of gay panic defense, you can attack and assault someone who is a part of the LGBTQ plus community. This is why we say gay as a blanket term, because we can't say it quickly. We'll get to that. If someone from the community gets attacked, the attacker can go into court and say, oh, they were gay, I panicked. and they will get a lesser sentence because that's a valid defense in 39 US states. And this is why it's so important to learn about these hate crimes and the fact that, as well as the numbers of at least a quarter of the individuals, no matter what, have experienced intense assault, half only verbal. 56 for verbal, 28% for physical. And then there are the microaggressions, which are the jokes, the language. Oh. It could be something like, come on, man, that's gay. Or it could be, ooh, what's a good example? Oh, no homo. There's that. There are many different microaggressions, subtle wrongs, tiny things that doesn't seem like it would hurt anyone, but after they build up over and over and over again, you're like, okay, this is getting on my nerves. It's a problem, an unfortunate problem, but a problem nonetheless. And we're going to end off quickly with the misgendering of someone who desires to be called he, for example, and you call them she. Simple as that. And that one, I wouldn't quite call a microaggression because it is very, very detrimental to that person's mental health if you misgender them. So it's prying on the line there, especially with it going through this entire thing of misgendering in a previous chapter, but we'll let it be because the book says it's a microaggression. We'll let it be. And now we get to the fun part of lesbian culture. They have a beautiful culture. And you can tell that the culture is genuinely a culture. For example, a recent thing of lesbian culture is you would make custom earrings. So people would attach earring things to random objects like bubble wands. And suddenly they now have bubble wands dangling from their ears. And that is something that they do to identify each other. In the sense of, as this grows and becomes a worldwide thing, a lesbian meets a lesbian from another culture, and they have a lot in common because they have their own culture. Every identity and orientation is probably going to develop their own intense culture that will be very, very relatable. On the other hand, if a heterosexual woman from one country meets a heterosexual woman from another country, they're not going to have as much in common as the lesbians, which is kind of a plus. We get to meet people and have something to talk about. So, the US Census. We all love that. We all love it so much. Well, in lesbian history, up until 2000, so 1999 and before, which includes 1990, any same-gender couple their genders were switched, literally switched in the census to be heterosexual couples, and that's something that blows my mind. The fact that this is a thing. But then the census allowed for same-sex partners, and allowed for civil unions, that's the word. Thank you, notes. Allows for civil unions, which is basically marriage, but without being the word marriage, so homophobes are more accepting of the fact that they can be couples. So it's basically a euphemism. And once in 2000 that was added to the census, there was a very, very low count, or likely low count, of 600,000 same-sex households that were pretty much even gay men and lesbian households. And 99% of every single US county had at least one of them, which is pretty widespread. It's people be with the people they love, even if it's legal or not. And then finally, in 2015, only 5 years ago, the marriage word was added. Same-sex marriage. Which was quite the boon for gays, lesbians, and all of the other identities and orientations. And the funny thing about civil unions is that 34% of lesbian civil unions had kids between each other from their current relationship with each other or from prior relationships. I believe the numbers were 14% was previous. I think so. No, 14% was from previous relationships. No, I can't remember the exact, but it was leaning a bit more towards prior relationships, but cut pretty evenly. Excuse me, I didn't write it down. I'm terribly sorry. And as going into the relationships, it was found that housework was done more evenly. Equality was very, very important for people, for specifically lesbians, that there is a very, very important balance. I'm saying very, very a lot, and I apologize. And they found that there are similar joys, satisfaction, loves, conflicts between each other, that two people in those relationships were a lot more similar than people of heterosexual couples. And when you're in them, you get the same amount of satisfaction in a same-sex relationship for people who want to be in them versus heterosexual relationships, which is quite the boon for the community. I covered all of that. Now, we get into just gay marriage in general, and court cases that go into them. And you can see in the civil union is used in place of marriage. That's kind of where all of this became a thing, where it begun in Vermont in 2000, along with the US Census, which is why I mentioned it back there. And it was all legalized because all citizens should have equal rights, including towards marriage equality. Which is a no-brainer. If you're a citizen of the United States of America, you should have equal rights to anyone else from the same country. Which, why did it take until 2015 to make this happen? I don't know, but here we are. Ah. I completely blanked out. Give me a second. To scroll down here. Alright. So, the book makes a statement that 5-year-olds haven't really developed an identity yet to the point where they would be able to say what their sexual orientation is because they are 5, and that this develops later in life, and that heterosexual people have the privilege of just assuming that they're heterosexual, while any other orientation has to come to the realization that they are not straight. And then we have the liberty of making jokes that say, I can never think straight. Which is the closest thing we can get to a privilege. And what I mentioned earlier about sexual fluidity is a part of this as well, with how women are much more responsive to both men or women. And it's very, very situation dependent, which goes into being able to be aroused by multiple stimuli, and all of it comes together. And accepting yourself as having a non-heterosexual orientation is confusing. Then you have to accept it, and then you're proud of it, and then you're me. And it's a nice experience to know who you are. And that all leads to coming out when you are prideful of who you are. You get to have the process of telling other people that you're a part of the community, that you are a non-heterosexual orientation, that you in some way are different than being just straight. You get to come out of the closet. And it's a very, very stressful experience that goes into it with the lesbian dual identity and the sense of being unable to feel safe in certain groups, which is what I referenced back to talk about heterosexism, that every orientation, but specifically the book talks about lesbians, is scared to be themselves around certain people, to where they may take a while to tell their parents, their family, they might take a while, depending on who their family are, depending on which groups they're around, and it forces them to do something called code switching, where they have to act differently around different groups of people in order to be accepted. And it's a very, very stressful process on the person, because they don't know which of them is being genuine. And if they do know, they have to hide that aspect of themselves when they're with other people. So, coming out can be freeing, but it can also be very, very stressful, depending on if you know how the people around you are going to react. But sometimes they react in ways that you don't expect. Oh. tried to switch slides and it didn't work. Okay, already did that. Yep. I don't need to even say that first point of it being a mental disorder. Luckily, it's not in the DSM anymore that homosexuality is seen as a mental disorder, and we are more accepting of these deviants. And it goes into... there is a lot of stressors that can go into causing these suicidal thoughts, such as if you are in the closet, if you are a lesbian woman in the closet, you would have a high degree of stress. If you come out of the closet, if you come out and you are reacted to negatively, you can have even worse suicidal thoughts, depression, and other mental health issues. But if you're reacted to positively, it changes quite a bit. And so that is shown by the other point of only 4.4% of heterosexual women have attempted suicide after the age of 18. On the slide says before, but the book says after, I'm pretty sure. But 18's the cutoff point, compared with 7.9% of lesbians. Which you could take it as, oh, lesbians are twice as likely to commit suicide than heterosexual women. Or you could say lesbians are only 3.5% as likely to attempt to commit suicide. And you could spin that so many different ways. So is it a glass half full, or glass half empty type of situation, as it says in the book, to try to understand how it all goes into it. And the most influential factor could be this minority stress theory, which describes that they're in a minority, and minorities have stigma. These stigmas can cause high amounts of stress, and these high amounts of stress can cause quite a bit of emotional distress. So it's a process that just goes through, and now they're in distress, and suddenly they are exhibiting symptoms of mental health issues, and that's also has a stigma against it. So there's another stigma that they have to deal with. And now if they're a person of color, they have more stigmas that they have to deal with, which just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. Which is a very, very difficult thing for anyone to go through. I did it again. Did it again. Didn't want to do that again. But the good thing is, there is therapy. But therapy can be difficult for LGBTQ plus clients. There are the guidelines, which, to summarize, is homosexuality is not wrong. Being queer is not wrong. They have to be aware if they have bias and either change that bias or refer them to someone who does not have that bias. Understand that there are societal standards and stigmas. Try to be knowledgeable and understanding to the issues, and be sensitive to the issues regarding the race in relation to being queer. So those are the basic guidelines for therapy, which are very, very important to know, and it can just be dealing with, honestly, these can be guidelines for handling friends, for helping, or just trying to understand anyone. You don't have to be a psychologist to follow these guidelines well. Just not the referment part of number 2, which these are summarized, and I tried to give a summary of the summary, which is always interesting. And for those families, those children that were mentioned, of 34% of lesbian couples at 2000 had children from their current relationship or previous relationship. Now, adoption can be a bit of a struggle because there is stigma against I am terribly sorry about that. There is stigma against children being raised by lesbians. But there were studies that followed these, and the children of lesbian mothers developed as well as, if not better than heterosexual parents. And these children often performed better on a few tests that was completed in those studies. And so, despite these lesbians being seen as unfit for parenthood, it's very visible that this isn't as much of a problem as people make it out to be. There is no evidence that is a cause for concern, which is good. People are people. Okay. Just checking. Alright. So, why do people become lesbian, bi, straight, these things? There's a few explanations that try to be done. First is the biological ones, where there are genetics, and there was a study that showed that 48% of identical female twins were the same sexual orientation. If it was specifically done only by genetics, it would have been 100%. So there is differences done. Now, so there is differences in other aspects such as the environment. But that study was redone, and it's shown that it's now at 24% of concordance. So it's very, very indeterminable if biology has something to do with it. And for the environmental aspect, there isn't much talked about in the book. It mentions modeling. The book mentions modeling, and modeling is imitating behaviors of people around you as a child, as we learned in previous chapters. And for these lesbian couples, the children were more likely to turn out heterosexual than lesbian, bi, or any other orientation that's not heterosexual. So modeling likely does not play a role, or much of a role if it does play one. Oh. it doesn't mention any hormone levels. And the book makes questions that hormones aren't quite knowledgeable in the sense of being able to know if it plays a role or not. Like, it mentions if CAH, the one of the versions of being intersex, if that has an effect on orientation. The book makes quite a few questions on it. So now we go into differences between lesbians and gay men, where lesbians have a higher emphasis on emotions and emotional intimacy. They are more towards long-term partners. They cheat less, and they are and and people who are in lesbian relationships are more likely to be bisexual than gay men are. Meanwhile, on the gay side, they have more partners, more sex in general, more cheating. 59% of gay men have cheated on a partner, compared with 8% of lesbians. They have higher amounts of negativity aimed at them as well. Gay men are much more stigmatized in society than lesbian women are. For example, men are a lot more aggressive towards gay men than they are towards lesbian women, because for them, lesbians are sexually attractive. On the other side, women don't really have much of a difference in caring about gay men versus lesbians. So the fact that men are much more aggressive towards gay men makes this disparity and the stigmatization of the gays. Alright. Reaching the end. You're almost free. Now, there are the sexual minority women of color. They are triple oppressed. They are women, they are people of color, and they are a part of a sexual minority. Those are three things that are against them. And that just makes it that much more difficult. For example, the Latinx lesbians, they aren't very much supported by the Latinx gay men. There was this activist group that was majority Latinx gay men, and the Latinx lesbians weren't quite allowed to be a part of that activist group for Latinx sexual minorities, because it would possibly what's the word? It doesn't matter. They could possibly change or disrupt the activism, and that Latinx lesbians get more support from feminists and feminism than they do from the Latinx group, so they founded their own. And Asian Americans are often in the same boat, except they are supposed to be even more conservative than Latinx are. On the other side, blacks are very, very unaccepting of any minority. They strive for acceptance, as said in the book. I'm using the book as reference here. That they strive for acceptance, so anything that's out of the norm of behavior is completely unacceptable. So, we now have the queer of color critique, an approach that brings together queer theory, feminist theory, and women of color feminism to show that, well, that we are trying to get an understanding of how these three things blend together and have an intersection. Oh, I forgot to mention for Asian Americans, with them being in the same boat and they're being more conservative, they can't talk about anything even to their families. So if they're anything but living for their families, they are looked down upon. So, that is the end. We are free. We are good to go. I hope I covered everything. This should be enough to at least get you through the study guide. And if not, you'd be able to find it in the book. Good luck. I hope it all worked out.